All right, welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. We always try to pick topics that'll really get you thinking. And today we've got a system of thought that's sure to resonate with all of you philosophers out there. It goes straight to the heart of those big questions about reality, knowledge, even consciousness itself.
Absolutely. Today we're going deep into Abhidharma. It's a fascinating system, really, that emerged in the early centuries after the Buddha's death, in those early Buddhist monastic communities. A lot of scholarship, a lot of debate swirling around, all trying to grasp the true nature of things.
So we're talking centuries of philosophical development, a sort of in-depth analysis of Buddhist teachings. That's a pretty ambitious undertaking.
Yeah, and it's right there in the name, Abhidharma. Sanskrit term, can be understood as concerning the teachings, so, pretty straightforward on that level.
Right, makes sense. Digging into the teachings, breaking them down.
Exactly. But the tradition itself, well, it kind of favored another interpretation, higher or further teaching. They really wanted to emphasize, I think, that this wasn't just repeating the basics. It was about pushing beyond, going deeper into the nuances and implications of those initial teachings.
So not just what was said, but what it all meant on a deeper philosophical level.
Precisely. And we have to remember, right, that when we say Abhidharma, we're talking about both the intellectual process itself, the inquiry, and the actual body of texts that came out of it. We call those the Abhidharma Piyaka. Imagine it as a collection, like a philosophical and psychological exploration of the Buddha's teachings, distinct from the discourses and the monastic rules.
Okay, so we've got these texts, these Abhidharma Pika, which are like a deep dive into the philosophical and psychological dimensions of Buddhism.
Yeah, think of it as a kind of systematic philosophy, but tailored specifically for those who were really engaged with the finer points of the doctrine.
Got it. So these texts, they emerge after the Buddha's passing, but how do they differ from those initial teachings, those sutras?
Well, you see, the Buddha's discourses, the sutras, they often relied on a more approachable style. They were full of stories, analogies, metaphors, designed to convey meaning in a way that most people could grasp. Abhidharma, though, it went in a very different direction. It embraced a highly analytical approach, carefully defining technical terms, really aiming for that kind of razor-sharp precision.
So if the sutras are about drawing people in with narratives and relatable examples, the Abhidharma is about building a rigorous analytical framework.
That's a great way to put it. It's like providing the theoretical architecture, that underpins the practice of meditation, a way to systematically map out the whole terrain of experience. And this leads us to the central concept of Abhidharma, the idea of breaking down conscious experience into its fundamental building blocks.
And those building blocks, if I'm not mistaken, are what we call dharmas.
You got it. The dharmas, or sometimes dhammas in Pali, they are, in essence, the irreducible elements of experience. Think of them as the atoms of reality, the fundamental units of existence.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get a sense of how radical this idea is. So it's not just that these dharmas exist, but that they're the basis for everything we experience.
Exactly. Every thought, every feeling, every sensation, even the physical world around us, all of it is analyzed and ultimately explained in terms of these dharmas. They're not just mental objects, though, but actual events.
Events, so they're dynamic, constantly changing.
Exactly. They arise, they have their moment, and then they vanish. We're talking incredibly rapid, fleeting occurrences. And the study of dharmas, what they are, how they interact, that whole inquiry is at the heart of what's called dharma theory. And this theory, it wasn't just limited to psychology. It extended into metaphysics, epistemology, even ontology. It was about understanding the very nature of being itself, of how we know, of what reality ultimately is.
Wow, okay. So this is clearly a comprehensive system, but with such detailed, even reductionistic analysis, I imagine there were some pretty heated debates.
Oh, there definitely were. These investigations, they inevitably led to all sorts of doctrinal controversies between different schools of Buddhist thought. And these weren't just minor disagreements. They were grappling with fundamental questions about the nature of reality, the self, even the path to enlightenment.
So the Abhidharma was like a philosophical crucible, forging new ideas, sparking new debates. That makes sense given the depth and complexity of the issues they were tackling. But you mentioned different schools of Buddhist thought. How did these different perspectives emerge within the early Buddhist community?
Well, it's natural, isn't it? After the Buddha's passing, people started to interpret and systematize his teachings in different ways. Around the 3rd century BCE, you see a major division arise between the Sthaviras and the Mahātthāgakas. From there, over centuries, all sorts of doctrinal nuances and interpretations led to the formation of various schools, each with their own unique emphasis.
So, not unlike different philosophical schools throughout history, like, for instance, how we have the Stoics and Epicureans in ancient Greece, or the Cartesians and British empiricists in early modern Europe. Different lineages, but all grappling with the same fundamental questions.
Right, exactly. And it's important to remember that these weren't necessarily rigid denominations, like sects. It was more like different communities of thought, each with their own particular interests and specializations.
So, they weren't necessarily at odds, but exploring different facets of the same philosophical landscape. And each of these schools, they developed their own unique versions of the Abhidharma.
Precisely. And while it's believed that many early schools had their own collections of these texts due to historical circumstances, only two complete canonical collections have survived to this day. The Sarvastivada school's Abhidharma, which was prominent in northern India and Central Asia, and the Theravada school's Abhidharma, which flourished in southern India and Southeast Asia.
So, two main branches, two sets of texts that have come down to us, each carrying their own unique perspectives on this complex system of thought.
Exactly. Both the Sarvastivada and Theravada traditions, they each have their own 7 core texts that make up their Abhidharma Piyaka, although the specific titles and content, they do differ between the two.
Okay, so 7 key texts for each school. That's a pretty substantial body of philosophical and psychological work.
Yeah, it is. It's like a whole library devoted to unpacking the intricacies of reality and the mind.
And this wasn't the end of it, was it? I mean, later scholars continued to build on these foundations.
Oh, absolutely. You see, later generations, they took those canonical Abhidharma texts and really delved into them. They wrote commentaries, explanations, sometimes even critiques, further developing those ideas and debating different interpretations.
It sounds like a vibrant intellectual tradition. So it wasn't just about preserving those original texts, but about engaging with them, debating them, pushing those ideas forward.
Exactly. In the Theravada tradition, for example, you have Buddhaghosa's Visuddhimagga, an incredibly influential and comprehensive commentary. And in the Sarvastivada tradition, you have Vasubandhu's Abhidharmakosha, another hugely important text that systematizes and presents the key ideas in a really clear and compelling way.
So we see this ongoing dialogue, this back and forth between generations of scholars, each building on and refining the work that came before. Now let's talk about the actual style of these Abhidharma texts. I imagine they're quite different from the narrative storytelling style we find in the sutras.
Oh, you're absolutely right. The style is very analytical, very systematic. It's all about meticulous summaries, breaking things down into categories, creating taxonomies for every aspect of experience.
So a much more structured, almost scientific approach to understanding reality.
Exactly. They loved using lists, too. In Sanskrit, they're called matska or matika. These lists were like their way of organizing information, creating these comprehensive frameworks for understanding different types of consciousness, mental factors, physical elements, you name it, they had a list for it.
Lists, categories, a drive towards comprehensiveness and precision. It really does sound like a different approach from the more narrative style of the Buddha's discourses.
And the way they went about explaining these ideas, it often involved this kind of question and answer format, like a teacher guiding a student through the intricacies of the doctrine step by step. But as the Abhidharma tradition developed, you also start to see more formal argumentation, explicit refutations of rival theories. It got pretty intense.
That makes sense. As different schools emerged, as they encountered other philosophical traditions, they had to sharpen their arguments and defend their positions.
Right, they weren't just content with laying out their own views. They wanted to show how their system was superior to others.
So we see this evolution in the Abhidharma, from lists and categories to full-blown philosophical debates. Now, I want to circle back to those dharmas. You said earlier that the Abhidharma offers a reinterpretation of the Buddha's analysis of experience, specifically those categories like name and form, or the 5 aggregates that we find in the sutras. How does it shift the perspective?
Well, the key difference, I think, is the timescale. You see, the sutras, they often talk about things like the 5 aggregates as relatively stable processes, things that endure over time. But the Abhidharma comes along and says, hold on a minute. Let's zoom in, weigh in, and see what's really going on. They radically reduce the time scale, analyzing everything in terms of these incredibly brief, momentary events, the dharmas.
So rather than thinking of consciousness as a continuous flow, they're saying it's more like a series of snapshots, each snapshot being a dharma.
Exactly. And these dharmas, they're not just abstractions. They're understood as actual psychophysical events, flashes of awareness interacting with our senses.
So every time we see something, hear something, think something, it's not a single continuous experience, but rather a rapid succession of these momentary dharmas arising and vanishing.
That's the idea. It's a radical reconceptualization of how we understand experience. Really, a kind of atomization of reality.
It's a mind-blowing concept for sure. And I can only imagine the implications it has for our understanding of the self, of identity, of continuity over time.
That's precisely where it gets really interesting, especially from a philosophical perspective. Because if everything is ultimately reducible to these fleeting, momentary dharmas, then what are we, really? What is it that experiences, that knows, that acts in the world?
It's like those questions we always grapple with in philosophy. The nature of self, the mind-body problem, the relationship between our perceptions and reality. The Abhidharma takes those questions and throws them into a whole new light.
It does. It makes you reevaluate everything you thought you knew about experience and about yourself.
All right, well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We've journeyed through the history of the Abhidharma, explored its key ideas, and even glimpsed at its profound philosophical implications. So as we start to wrap up, what would you say are some of the essential takeaways for our listeners?
Well, first and foremost, I think it's important to appreciate the sheer scale and ambition of this project. The Abhidharma isn't just some esoteric side note in Buddhist thought. It's a massive, systematic undertaking to map out the entire territory of experience, from the most basic mental events to the complexities of consciousness and perception. We talked about how both the Theravada and Sarvastivada traditions developed their own intricate systems of Dharma classification, each with dozens of categories and countless subdivisions.
A truly Herculean effort at categorization and analysis. It's like creating a comprehensive encyclopedia of the mind and reality.
Precisely. And then there's the doctrine of momentariness, this radical idea that everything we experience is ultimately made up of these incredibly fleeting events. That's a major shift from earlier Buddhist thought, and it has huge implications for how we understand the self, the world, and the nature of change itself.
And all of this led to some fascinating debates about the nature of reality, right? We touched on the concept of intrinsic nature, or swabhava, and how different schools grappled with what that means for our understanding of categories, of existence, of how we make sense of the world around us.
Right, and those debates are still relevant today. They force us to confront some really fundamental questions about the relationship between language, concepts, and reality itself.
It's like the Abhidharma was ahead of its time, grappling with issues that are still at the forefront of contemporary philosophy.
It really was. And I think that's one of the reasons why it continues to fascinate scholars and practitioners alike.
So we've gone from the basic building blocks of experience to the nature of reality itself, all through the lens of the Abhidharma. It's been quite a journey.
It has. And it's a journey that, in many ways, is just beginning.
That's right. And for all of you out there who are already deep into these philosophical waters, we want to leave you with one final thought to ponder. Given the Abhidharma's emphasis on breaking down experience into these momentary dharmas, these fleeting events, what does that mean for our understanding of something as fundamental as identity? If everything is in constant flux, if there's no enduring self, then what is it that experiences, that knows, that makes choices, that lives a life? Is it possible to reconcile this reductionistic view of experience with the intuitive sense we have of ourselves as continuous beings, as agents who persist over time? And if so, how?
It's a question that has no easy answers, and it's one that the Abhidharma invites us to explore.
It does, and we encourage you to continue this exploration, to delve into those primary texts, to wrestle with those questions, to see where they lead you. Because in many ways, I think the Abhidharma is as much about the questions it raises as it is about the answers it offers.
And those questions, they can lead us to some profound insights about the nature of reality, the mind, and the very essence of what it means to be human.
Absolutely. So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.